Those kinds of groupings were common in the 1970s. The fact that they formed these well-known bands annoyed us. Prior to George Harrison, these well-known individuals were referred to as the quiet Beatle, and had a strong spirituality and meditation practice. There were many negative things he said about rock. Although George appeared composed, he was unable to tolerate anything that he perceived as phony or musically uninteresting. He might be cruel. According to a person who was familiar with the Beatles, if he thought a band was rubbish, he'd just say so and walk off. George wasn't always courteous, but John and Paul were. He expressed his feelings to others. He would have famous outbursts in private and occasionally in public because he was so angry at certain musicians. Today, we will discuss the 6 bands that truly enraged George Harrison. They caused him to sneer, switch the station, or even mock them in front of his pals. These accounts of Harrison's cruel remarks, chilly encounters, and overt musical sarcasm reveal a completely different side of the guy who wasn't hesitant to expose the fraud in the music industry. Some of the names on this list may surprise you. Not so much for some. Let's examine the behaviors that George Harrison found intolerable. The Monkees are the 6th band. George Harrison reportedly believed that the Monkees were the worst thing about contemporary music when they first came out in 1966. They weren't a legitimate band, in his opinion. They existed. That's not a band. It's a television program. Once, he became upset when someone compared them to the Beatles. Harrison was acting civil. He was personally offended, according to many close to him, that a group formed for a sitcom could be mentioned in the same sentence as the Beatles, who had spent years honing their skill in steamy clubs. Every time a Monkees song came on, George would switch the station, according to Mal Evans, a writer with the Beatles. One time he couldn't turn off a hotel radio quickly enough, so he destroyed it. When he discovered that the Monkees didn't use their own instruments on the first few tracks, he became furious. He worked his fingers raw in Hamburg, a friend named Terry Doran recounts. Then these guys get handed hit records and call themselves a band. Not even the sight of them pleased George. "We live that life," he reportedly told George Martin, the filmmaker. "These children are merely acting out a role." And when the Monkees later tried to become a real band, Harrison mocked them again. Someone who portrays a doctor on television might assume that he is suddenly capable of performing surgery. Things worsened when Monkees drummer Mickey Dolenz tried to approach him at a gathering in Los Angeles. After seeing George, one person remarked, "I'd rather talk to the caterers. At least they deserve to be here." Later in life, Harrison did show some generosity. He said, "They were just kids caught up in the machine," to Rolling Stone. "I was having problems with the equipment, not them." However, those close to him claim that he never again listened to a Monkees song by himself. The Doors are number 5. George Harrison considered Jim Morrison to be a moving comedy, even though he was referred to as a rock artist. According to former Beatles member Tony Bramble, George believed the Doors were intellectually ridiculous. A band who lacked the ability to support its excessively solemn tone. Morrison, "He's a cartoon," George reportedly jokingly stated, mocking Jim's deep-voiced poetry in front of his buddies. "I am the Lizard King of absolute rubbish," he would declare, and everyone would laugh. But Jim wasn't the only one. George was having problems with the entire band. During the Doors' 1968 performance at the Hollywood Bowl, guitarist Robert Krieger attempted to discuss Indian music with Harrison. George allegedly ignored him, saying, "You wouldn't know a sitar from a guitar strap." Harrison allegedly attacked the Doors pianist in letters to Eric Clapton, writing things such, "Ray Manzarek thinks he's Bach because he can play with 2 hands. My Aunt Mimi must be Chopin since that is so intelligent." Despite the jokes and teasing, George wasn't entirely impolite. He once claimed that the Doors song, "The End," had accidentally created something intriguing. Perhaps the most he ever acknowledged their work was a slight nod. However, those who knew George were aware that he didn't enjoy the Doors' musical style. Too many smoke and mirrors, too much ego, and not enough music. Number 4 is the Rolling Stones. Although George Harrison and the Rolling Stones appeared to be friendly rivals, George harbored deep affections for the Stones when they weren't present. He allegedly referred to them as a blues karaoke act and said they were constantly imitating the Beatles. George Martin reportedly heard him say, "We'd put out Rubber Soul, and they'd do Aftermath. We'd make Sgt. Pepper, and they'd rush to make their Satanic Majesties. At the very least, create your own map." The fact that George had a close friendship with Keith Richards made it even more challenging. They would jam together after work. But Harrison would inform the others that the Stones were killing music after the show. The 1967 drug bust didn't help either. It was reported that George believed it to be a publicity stunt. "He's playing Revolution," George reportedly told Mick Jagger as he stepped up his counterculture persona. "We're actually attempting to be one." Harrison was deeply offended when Jagger received his MBE in 2003. "Mick spent 50 years trying to be us," he reportedly stated. "Now the Queen's bought it, too." In public, George was pleasant. Tight smiles and few words. However, witnesses report that the rage was intense. Although they both like blues music, Harrison found what he perceived as image over substance behavior intolerable. According to some music historians, the sarcasm was actually an expression of melancholy. It's probable that George's hatred of the Stones wasn't so much directed at their music as it was at how far they had deviated from their core value of honesty. The Bee Gees come in third. Even though George Harrison was a spiritual person, he still had a lot of issues with the Bee Gees, particularly after they began performing dance music. Klaus Voormann, a longtime friend of George's, claims that George once declared disco to be the cultural bottom of the globe. One day, when "Stayin' Alive" was playing at a garden center, George reportedly yelled aloud, which is not something that happens very often. But it was more than just the genre. George believed that the Bee Gees had betrayed their British heritage by adopting popular culture. In the late 1960s, when the Bee Gees were only beginning to write ballads, he is reported to have told friends, they were the tragedy of real talent given up for fashion. Harrison had previously made negative remarks. He reportedly protested to Neil Aspinall about the Beatles songs being printed with a messy edge. Things really went haywire when the Bee Gees went all out with disco at a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame celebration. George reportedly avoided them on purpose, whispering to Ringo, "I've sworn never to interact with musical opportunists. This is the finest part." George's own record label, Dark Horse Records, assisted in promoting the Bee Gees recordings during the Saturday Night Fever frenzy. George, according to accounts, refused to read sales statistics because he believed that doing so was auditory punishment for the masses. However, it wasn't all black and white. Maurice Gibb wrote George a kind letter a few years ago when he was diagnosed with cancer. A copy of God Only Knows was part of George's collection. Behind the sarcasm might have been a sliver of respect. Oasis is the second. George Harrison was most incensed about Oasis out of all the bands that were still playing and praising the Beatles. The sound was not all there was to it. George reportedly believed that the Gallagher brothers were the worst Beatles fans. They were impolite, arrogant, and completely misguided. Donnie, his son, stated in 2010 that they thought being a rock star meant being annoying. "Dad used to say, we broke rules. To free people, not to teach them how to be jerks." The final straw was Noel Gallagher's assertion that Oasis was more popular than the Beatles. George allegedly faxed their supervisor and got a single response, "You're not even bigger than the Rudless." George only grinned when asked about the public remark, adding, "I hope their egos don't get in the way." According to friends, he declined multiple opportunities to meet the band. His wife Olivia reportedly heard him say, "I spent 30 years trying to get away from what they're trying to become." Then there was that embarrassing moment when George silently watched an Oasis music video at a friend's house. He reportedly remarked, "They're like someone who read the Bible but missed the whole point." However, some critics claim that Harrison's later solo work sounded a lot like Oasis and was a back to basics style. Perhaps the most agonizing part was that he observed them repeatedly playing his music, but they were removing the significance of the message. First place goes to the Beach Boys. George Harrison's favorite band to despise was the Beach Boys, which may surprise you. They were viewed as cool surf pop stars by many admirers, but George reportedly detested them, particularly Brian Wilson. Former Beatles photographer Astrid Kircher recalled George's comment that the band's music was like musical Coca-Cola, all fizz, sugar, and no substance. His distaste started early. "They asked how we got our guitar sound," is what George reportedly stated to John Lennon after they first met the Beatles in 1965. "I should have told them that they needed to learn how to play first." It got worse during the Pet Sounds vs. Sgt. Pepper era. George felt that Brian Wilson's new idea was too big of a deal, but Paul McCartney liked it. Pet Sounds, according to reports, was nothing more than 4 good songs buried under conceptual fluff. Despite their shared interest in spirituality, they were unable to get along. In 1968, Dennis Wilson attempted to discuss transcendence with George while attending a meditation camp. "Surfing isn't enlightenment, mate," said George. "It's simply becoming damp." George is reported to have sat there with a blank expression on his face during the Beach Boys' induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame years later. Later, someone asked him what he thought of it. According to reports, he declared, "America has finally found its answer to the Beatles." Unfortunately, they asked the wrong question. However, contradictions were unavoidable even for George. The fact that he had a copy of God Only Knows in his own collection was a subliminal indication that perhaps, just possibly, he liked the harmony lines he claimed to dislike. It's as simple as that. 6 vocalists were able to establish a connection with the reserved Beatles. Despite his seeming serenity and spirituality, George Harrison was a music lover who didn't hesitate to voice his opinions when he felt they were being dismissed. George's critiques were personal as well as cruel. He criticized copycats, selfish bands, and phony industry tools. He believed that music was sacred and should be created from the heart rather than in a studio that was attempting to fit in with the newest trends. Some of these altercations have altered our perception of Harrison's personal life, while others have resolved themselves. It's possible that he was a quiet perfectionist who merely wanted music to have meaning rather than being cruel. What about one of George's singing battles surprised you the most? Post your comments below.